The next section is going to be dealing with agency and what our relationship is with contracts and agency. And remember that all agency is certain laws or rules that we have that govern the way that we treat people that we do business with. And I think it goes without saying that there are certain duties that we're going to be responsible for doing. Some are fiduciary and some are not. But let me say this, as far as legal instructions, when we're dealing with buyers and sellers, no matter what our agency relationship is, one of the things that we cannot do is follow an illegal instruction. If somebody asks us to discriminate, we can't do that. So just understand that there's certain things that we can and can't do. There's going to be certain requirements for disclosing our agency relationship. And in the state of Florida, we have 3 agency relationships: single agent, transaction brokerage, and the no brokerage relationship. The only disclosures that have to be given out are going to be for the single agent relationship and for the no brokerage relationship. And these have to be done, all these disclosures have to do with residential transactions. And let me say the easiest way to remember a residential transaction, if it's up to 4 units, whether it's the actual units or vacant land to be used for that, and also agricultural properties that are 10 acres or less, those are categorized as residential properties. Non-residential don't require these disclosures. As I mentioned, the authorized relationships that we have, I want to talk about the no brokerage relationship. This is a relationship that a broker has with a buyer or a seller that probably has the least amount of obligation to it. We have to deal open, honest, and fair. We have to disclose latent material defects. And if they give us a deposit, we have to put it in escrow according to rules. That is about as far as that goes. And we have to give a disclosure that we're acting in this relationship prior to showing property. Another type of relationship that we have is called single agent relationship. Now this one is the one with a lot of obligations. In fact, it has the most obligations. The single agent relationship is a fiduciary relationship. In other words, in the single agent, we're supposed to be looking out for our client's best interest over everybody else. We have the relationship of loyalty, obedience, confidentiality, full disclosure. So we have a lot of obligations to that buyer and seller. I think it's important to note, though, for a single agent, that we cannot represent both a buyer and a seller as a single agent at the same time. That would create a dual agency, and dual agency was repealed a number of years ago. The disclosure for the single agent relationship has to be done either prior to showing property or prior to entering into a contract. One of the things about single agent that the no brokerage did not have was skill, care, and diligence. Skill, care, and diligence can create culpable negligence for us. So the no brokerage relationship, I guess, leaves us that ability to be able to practice real estate without that culpable aspect of it. The last relationship that we have is called the transaction brokerage relationship. And the way that this operates is that in the state of Florida, we are presumed to be transaction brokers unless we enter into an agreement with one of the others. Also, there are no disclosure forms that we have to give out if we're going to be acting as a transaction broker. The transaction broker is a limited relationship. It's a limited disclosure. We have to be very careful of what we say. We are allowed to work with both the buyer and the seller at the same time, but we can't take sides. We can't tilt. We can't say or do something that's going to be disadvantageous to the other party. So we have to be very careful of the things that we say. Transaction brokerage also has skill, care, and diligence. So both single agent and transaction brokerage has skill, care, and diligence, which could lead to culpable negligence. The no brokerage relationship doesn't have that. As far as transitioning, Florida law allows us to transition from a single agent relationship into a transaction brokerage relationship. It's important to understand, though, that the single agent, the way that you have to view this is that you're representing that person's best interest. You're working for them. The transaction brokerage, you're not working for their best interest. You're not working for them, but rather working with them. And therefore, when you're transitioning from a single agent relationship into a transaction brokerage, we have to get a consent form signed by your client. And what they're saying is that I acknowledge that you're stepping out of a fiduciary into a non-fiduciary relationship. And that's the only form that has to be signed. When we're dealing with non-residential real estate, oftentimes because of the confidentiality and the nature of the transaction, we have to act in more of a fiduciary role. And a designated sales associate is simply a position that a sales associate might have in a non-residential transaction that will allow them to have more of a fiduciary role. Let me expand that. What we have is a brokerage that has two agents within that brokerage. One agent is working with the buyer, one agent is working with the seller. And that both the buyer and the seller have assets of at least $1 million or more. In that scenario, these agents are allowed to take on that designated sales associate role and act more in a fiduciary role than in a transaction brokerage role. Keep in mind that broker is still going to be responsible for the outcome. Regarding termination of agency, I can say this is that agency and our listing contracts typically run parallel with each other. We obviously would like performance, so we'd like to be able to do what we say we're going to do. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that if your client or customer files bankruptcy, that property is turned over to the bankruptcy courts, and a trustee now has control. Therefore, any listing contract or any kind of agency relationship that you think you had is now terminated. And that's all we have for the agency section of this chapter. And so what I'd like to do right now is review with you those important areas of critical concern. A licensee must obey all legal instructions or withdraw. And what that also means is that we are prohibited from obeying illegal instructions. Agency disclosures are only required in a residential transaction for properties up to 4 units and agricultural properties of 10 acres or less. The no brokerage relationship does not offer skill, care, and diligence, whereas single agent and transaction brokers do. Real estate licensees are presumed to be transaction brokers unless another agency relationship is agreed upon. The only disclosure form that must be signed by a client is the consent to transition to a transaction brokerage relationship. The designated sales associate is created when a broker has one agent working with the seller and another agent working with the buyer, where both buyer and seller have assets of $1 million or more, and it's a non-residential transaction. And that's all we have for that section on agency.